My son left me in a nursing home. He didn't expect the call from my attorney. I'm sitting in a lawyer's office right now, watching my attorney dial my son's number. In about 30 seconds, my son Michael is going to answer his phone and hear something he never expected to hear. Something that's going to change his life completely. The funny thing is, he thinks I'm sitting in a nursing home right now, staring at 4 white walls, forgotten and helpless. He thinks I'm too old, too confused, too broken to do anything about what he did to me. He's wrong. Dead wrong. And the call he's about to receive is going to prove just how wrong he is. But before my attorney presses that call button, before everything changes, I need to tell you how we got here. I need to tell you about the son I raised, the man he became, and the moment I realized that sometimes the people you sacrifice everything for are the ones who'll abandon you the fastest. My name is James Sully. I'm 74 years old, and this is the story of how my own son tried to lock me away and steal everything I'd worked my entire life to build. If you've ever felt betrayed by family, if you've ever wondered if you matter to the people you love most, then stay with me because what happens next will shock you. And if you're getting value from this story, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe, because by the end of this, you'll understand why speaking up and fighting back is the only option when family turns against you. Let me take you back 14 months. That's when this nightmare started. Though the warning signs have been there for years, if I'm being honest with myself. I'm 74 years old, and until recently, I was living in the house I built with my own hands 48 years ago in Burlington, Ontario. It's a beautiful property, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, sitting on 2 acres of land with mature oak trees and a garden that my late wife Patricia tended, until the day she died. Patricia passed away 5 years ago from complications with diabetes. We'd been married for 51 years. After she died, I stayed in that house because every corner held a memory of her. The kitchen, where she'd bake bread every Sunday. The garden, where she'd spend hours talking to her roses like they were old friends. The porch where we'd sit together every evening watching the sunset. I wasn't ready to let those memories go, so I stayed, and I managed just fine on my own. I'm 74, not 104. I can cook my own meals, clean my own house, manage my own finances. I have arthritis in my knees that makes stairs a bit difficult, and my hearing isn't what it used to be. But I'm sharp. My mind is clear. I read the newspaper every morning. I manage my investment portfolio online. I volunteer at the local food bank twice a week. I'm living, not just existing. My son Michael is 46 years old. He's a real estate developer, married to a woman named Diane, and they have 2 kids. My grandchildren, Emma and Jake. For years, Michael and I had a good relationship. Not perfect, but good. He'd come by for Sunday dinners, bring the kids to visit, call me on holidays. But about 3 years ago, things started to change. He started talking about the house more. How big it was for just one person. How much maintenance it required. How expensive property taxes were. How I was getting older, and maybe it was time to think about downsizing. At first, I thought he was just concerned about me. A good son worrying about his aging father. But then the conversation started including suggestions about what I should do with the property. He'd say things like how the land was worth at least $800,000 now. Maybe more if developed properly. He'd mentioned that his development company could handle the sale. That he knew buyers who'd pay top dollar. He'd suggest I could move into a nice condo somewhere, something smaller and easier to manage, and live off the proceeds. I always told him the same thing. I wasn't ready to sell. This was my home. This was where Patricia and I built our life together. This was where I raised him. I wasn't leaving until I was ready, and I wasn't ready. But Michael didn't stop. The suggestions became more frequent, more insistent. He started bringing Diane with him, and she'd chime in with comments about how worried they were. How the house was too much for me. How they'd heard about elderly people falling downstairs or forgetting to turn off the stove. They'd mention incidents that never happened. Like the time I supposedly left the front door unlocked all night. Or the time I apparently forgot I'd already eaten dinner and made a second meal. None of these things happened. I'm forgetful sometimes, sure. I might lose my reading glasses or forget where I parked at the grocery store. But I'm not senile. I'm not incompetent. Yet Michael and Diane kept building this narrative that I was declining, that I needed help, that I was becoming a danger to myself. Then about 18 months ago, Michael started talking about nursing homes. Not assisted living facilities where you have your own apartment and independence. Full nursing homes where you share a room and have staff monitoring you around the clock. He'd bring me brochures, glossy pamphlets showing smiling elderly people playing bingo and sitting in wheelchairs. He'd tell me these places were wonderful, that I'd have people to socialize with, that I wouldn't be lonely, that I'd be safe. I told him I wasn't interested. I wasn't lonely. I had friends, I had my volunteer work, I had my routines. I was happy in my home. But Michael wouldn't let it go. Then came the incident that Michael used as his excuse to do what he did. Last November, I had a fall. Nothing serious. I was carrying a box of books down from the attic, missed the last step, and twisted my ankle. I called Michael because I needed a ride to the walk-in clinic to get it checked out. He came immediately, took me to the doctor, waited while they examined me. The doctor said it was a mild sprain, gave me some anti-inflammatory medication, told me to rest it for a few days and use ice. No big deal. But Michael acted like I'd had a stroke. He insisted on staying at my house that night, said he was worried about me being alone. I told him I was fine, but he wouldn't leave. The next morning, he was still there, and Diane had come over too. They made breakfast and sat me down at the kitchen table. Michael said they needed to talk to me about my safety. He said the fall proved that I couldn't live alone anymore, that the house was too dangerous, that I needed supervised care. I told him he was overreacting. It was a twisted ankle, not a life-threatening injury. But he had this look on his face, this determined, almost cold expression that I'd never seen before. He said he'd been talking to a lawyer, that he was concerned about my capacity to make decisions, that he thought it might be time to consider power of attorney. That's when I started to understand what was really happening. This wasn't about my safety. This was about my house. This was about my assets. Michael wanted control. I told him absolutely not. I told him I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, and that I didn't need anyone making decisions for me. He backed off that day, but I could tell he wasn't done. Over the next few months, Michael's visits became more frequent but less pleasant. He'd come over and inspect the house like he was looking for problems. He'd point out peeling paint, a loose railing, leaves in the gutters. He'd make comments about how I was letting the place go, how it was too much work for me. He'd offer to help with repairs, but when I'd accept, he'd never follow through. He was building a case, I realized. He was documenting every little flaw, every minor issue, so he could later claim I wasn't capable of maintaining the property. Then in March of this year, Michael showed up with a social worker. He called ahead and said he was bringing someone to meet me, but he didn't say who. When they arrived, he introduced her as Karen Mitchell from Elder Services. She was a pleasant woman in her 50s, and she explained that Michael had contacted her office with concerns about my living situation. She said she just wanted to have a conversation with me, to assess my needs and see if there were any supports that could help me. I was furious. Michael had gone behind my back and reported me to social services like I was a neglected child. But I stayed calm. I invited Karen in, offered her tea, and we talked for about an hour. She asked me about my daily routines, my health, my social connections, my finances. I answered every question honestly and thoroughly. I showed her around the house. I demonstrated that I could cook, clean, manage medications, pay bills. I showed her my calendar full of volunteer shifts and social engagements. I showed her my bank statements proving I was financially stable. At the end of the visit, Karen told Michael that I was clearly competent and capable, that I didn't require intervention, and that I had the right to live independently in my own home as long as I chose to do so. She said if I ever needed help in the future, I could contact her office directly. But there were no current concerns. Michael's face darkened. He thanked her for coming, walked her out, and then came back into the house. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just looked at me with this expression of cold disappointment and said he was trying to help me, and I was being stubborn and foolish. He said I'd regret this. Then he left. I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks after that. No calls, no visits. The grandchildren didn't come by. It was like he'd cut me off completely. Then one evening in late April, Michael showed up at my door with 2 paramedics. He told me he'd called for a wellness check because I hadn't been answering my phone, and he was worried. This was a lie. My phone had been working fine, and I'd actually talked to my neighbor that same afternoon. But the paramedics were there, and they had to follow protocol. They asked me some questions, checked my vital signs, looked around the house. One of them asked if I felt safe, if anyone was hurting me, if I needed help. I told them I was fine, that this was unnecessary, that my son was overreacting. They seemed satisfied and prepared to leave, But then Michael pulled one of them aside. I couldn't hear exactly what he said, but I heard fragments. Something about confusion, forgetfulness, safety concerns. The paramedic came back and asked me if I'd be willing to go to the hospital, just for a quick evaluation, just to make sure everything was okay. I didn't want to go, but I also didn't want to seem uncooperative or paranoid. So I agreed. They took me to Burlington Hospital, and I sat in the emergency room for 3 hours while they ran tests, blood work, cognitive assessments, physical examinations. Everything came back normal. The doctor told me I was healthy for my age, that there were no concerns, and that I was free to go home. But when I asked the nurse to call me a taxi, she said my son was in the waiting room and would take me home. I went out to find Michael, and he was there with Diane and a woman I didn't recognize. Michael introduced her as Dr. Sarah Winters, a geriatric specialist. He said he'd asked her to consult on my case. Like I was a patient, a problem to be solved. Dr. Winters was professional but firm. She said that while my test results were fine, she was concerned about my living situation. She said that at my age, living alone in a large house was risky, that one fall could be catastrophic, that I should consider transitioning to a facility where I'd have support and supervision. I told her I'd already had this conversation with my son multiple times and that I wasn't interested. She said she understood, but she encouraged me to think about it carefully, to consider what would happen if I had a serious medical emergency with no one around to help. Then Michael spoke up. He said he'd found a wonderful place, Meadowbrook Care Center, just 20 minutes away. He said it was top-rated, beautiful, with private rooms and great staff. He said he'd already arranged a tour for tomorrow, and he wanted me to just come look at it. No pressure. I was exhausted. It was almost midnight. I just wanted to go home. So I said fine, I'd look at it just to get him to stop. The next day, Michael picked me up and drove me to Meadowbrook. It was exactly what I expected. A nice enough building on the outside, landscaped grounds, fresh paint. But inside, it was a nursing home. Fluorescent lights, linoleum floors, the smell of disinfectant trying to cover something else. Old people in wheelchairs lined up in hallways. A television blaring in a common room where no one was watching it. The director gave us a tour, showing us a private room that was about half the size of my current bedroom. She talked about meal schedules, activity programs, visiting hours. She mentioned that residents weren't allowed to have cars, that medications were managed by staff, that there was a curfew for safety reasons. This wasn't assisted living. This was institutional care. This was for people who genuinely couldn't care for themselves. I told Michael this wasn't appropriate for me, that I didn't need this level of care. He said I should just think about it, that the room wouldn't be available for long, that it was hard to get into good facilities. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said he'd already put down a deposit to hold the room. He committed me to this place without my permission. I told him to get his deposit back because I wasn't coming here. He said the deposit was non-refundable, that it was done, that I should just accept that this was the best option. We drove back to my house in silence. When we got there, I told Michael to leave and not come back until he was ready to respect my choices. He said I was being unreasonable and that he was only trying to help. I closed the door in his face for the next 2 weeks. Michael called me every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. The conversations were always the same. He'd ask if I'd reconsidered. I'd say no, and he'd launch into all the reasons why I was wrong. He'd talk about the deposit he'd lost, about how worried he was, about how I was being selfish by not thinking about how this affected him. Finally, I stopped answering his calls. Then on May 15th, everything changed. I was in my garden that afternoon, planting tomatoes. It was a beautiful spring day, warm and sunny. I heard a car pull into my driveway, and I assumed it was a delivery or maybe my neighbor stopping by. But when I came around to the front of the house, I saw Michael's car, and he wasn't alone. There were 2 other men with him, both large, both wearing uniforms. Private transport service, it said on their jackets. Michael walked up to me with a piece of paper in his hand. He said he'd obtained an emergency court order for a psychiatric evaluation. He said I'd been exhibiting signs of dementia and paranoia, that I was a danger to myself, and that the court had authorized him to have me transported to a facility for assessment. I told him this was insane, that I wasn't going anywhere. But he nodded to the 2 men, and they moved toward me. They weren't rough, but they were firm. They each took one of my arms and started walking me toward their van. I was shouting, telling them to let me go, that this was kidnapping. But they had their court order, and they were following it. They put me in the van. Michael didn't ride with us. He followed behind in his own car. We drove straight to Meadowbrook, the nursing home. When we arrived, they took me inside and straight to the room Michael had reserved. A nurse came in and explained that I'd be staying here for a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric evaluation. She said it was for my own safety, that the doctor would see me tomorrow, and that I should try to rest. I demanded to use a phone. She said I could have phone privileges after the evaluation. I asked for a lawyer. She said I could request that through the proper channels, but right now I needed to cooperate with the assessment process. Then she left, and I heard the door lock click. They'd locked me in. I was a prisoner in a nursing home because my own son had lied to a court about my mental state. That first night was the worst night of my life. Worse than when Patricia died, because at least then I understood what was happening and why. This was surreal. I kept thinking I'd wake up and it would be a nightmare. But morning came, and I was still there. A nurse brought me breakfast on a tray, standard institutional food. She was kind but professional. She asked how I'd slept, if I needed anything. I told her I needed to talk to whoever was in charge, that I was being held here against my will, that this was illegal. She said the doctor would see me at 10:00 single quotes clock. Dr. Patel arrived at 10:15. He was a middle-aged man with a clipboard and a tired expression. He sat down across from me and started asking questions. What year is it? Who's the prime minister? Can you count backwards from 100 by sevens? I answered every question correctly. He asked about my medical history, my daily routines, my mood. I told him I was angry and upset because I'd been brought here against my will, based on false allegations. He made notes but didn't comment. Then he asked about my relationship with my son. I told him the truth, that Michael had been pressuring me to sell my house, that he'd been building a false narrative about my incompetence, that I believed this was about money and control, not about my welfare. Dr. Patel listened, made more notes, and then told me he'd need a few days to complete his assessment. I asked when I could leave. He said that would depend on his findings. That was it. The evaluation. 15 minutes of questions, and I was still locked up. Over the next 3 days, I was visited by nurses, social workers, occupational therapists. They all asked similar questions, observed me, made their notes. I cooperated fully because I knew if I resisted, they'd use it as evidence of paranoia or combativeness. I was polite, rational, clear. I answered every question, participated in every activity they asked me to do. On day 4, Dr. Patel came back. He told me his assessment was complete. He said that based on his evaluation, I showed no signs of dementia, psychosis, or any psychiatric condition that would prevent me from living independently. He said I was being released and was free to go home. Relief flooded through me. I asked if someone could drive me back to my house. Dr. Patel's expression changed. He said that was going to be a problem. While I'd been undergoing evaluation, my son Michael had filed for emergency guardianship. He'd presented the court with documentation of my supposed cognitive decline, statements from witnesses claiming I'd been confused and forgetful, and the fact that I'd required a psychiatric evaluation. The court had granted temporary guardianship pending a full hearing. What did that mean? It meant Michael now had legal control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my living arrangements. And he'd made a decision. I wouldn't be going back to my house. I'd be staying at Meadowbrook permanently. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Dr. Patel seemed uncomfortable. He said he noted in his report that I was competent and didn't require institutional care, but that the guardianship issue was a legal matter, not a medical one. He suggested I contact a lawyer. I asked again to use a phone. This time, they let me. I called the only lawyer I knew, Robert Shen, who had handled Patricia's estate when she died. I explained the situation. Robert was shocked. He said what Michael had done was extremely unusual. That guardianship cases typically took months and required substantial evidence of incompetence. He asked if I'd been notified of any court hearings. I said no. Robert said that was a violation of my rights, that I should have been given notice and an opportunity to contest the guardianship. He said he'd look into it immediately and get back to me. 2 days later, Robert came to visit me at Meadowbrook. He brought bad news. Michael had indeed obtained temporary guardianship, and he'd done it through an ex parte hearing, meaning I wasn't notified or present. Michael had presented evidence including statements from Diane, claiming I'd been confused during visits, a statement from a neighbor who said she'd seen me wandering my property looking lost, which was absolutely false, and documentation of the psychiatric evaluation order, which Michael had framed as proof I was unstable. The judge had granted temporary guardianship with the full hearing scheduled for 6 weeks later. Robert said we could fight this, that the evidence was thin and likely fabricated, but it would take time. In the meanwhile, Michael had legal authority, and Michael had already started exercising that authority. Robert showed me documents. Michael had listed my house for sale. He transferred funds from my bank accounts into an account he controlled as guardian. He'd begun the process of liquidating my investment portfolio. I felt sick. This was exactly what I'd feared. This wasn't about my safety or my welfare. This was about Michael getting his hands on my assets. Robert could see the rage on my face. He told me to stay calm, that anger wouldn't help, that we needed to be strategic. He said the key was the guardianship hearing. If we could prove I was competent and that Michael had lied to obtain guardianship, the judge would terminate it and I'd regain control. But we needed evidence and we needed witnesses. Over the next 3 weeks, Robert worked fast. He gathered my medical records proving I had no cognitive impairment. He got Dr. Patel to provide a sworn statement that I was competent. He tracked down the neighbor who'd allegedly seen me wandering confused, and she admitted she'd never said that Michael had misrepresented a casual conversation they'd had. He contacted Karen Mitchell, the social worker who'd evaluated me months earlier, and she agreed to testify that I'd been fully capable during her assessment. Robert also hired a forensic accountant to review Michael's financial transactions as my guardian. What they found was damning. Michael had sold my house for $820,000, but instead of putting that money into a trust for my care, he transferred $700,000 of it into his development company's account. He claimed it was to pay himself back for my care expenses at Meadowbrook, but the nursing home costs were only about $4,000 per month. Michael had essentially stolen $700,000 from me. The hearing was scheduled for July 2nd. Robert filed a motion to have the guardianship terminated immediately based on fraud and misrepresentation. We walked into that courtroom with a stack of evidence and a list of witnesses ready to testify. Michael was there with his lawyer, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit. Diane was there too, sitting behind Michael looking nervous. The judge was a woman named Justice Patricia Morrison. She reviewed the case file, then looked at Michael and asked him to explain why he'd sought guardianship. Michael stood up and gave this whole speech about how worried he'd been about me, how I'd been declining, how he'd only wanted to protect me and make sure I was safe. He talked about the fall, about my supposed confusion, about his concerns. Then Justice Morrison asked to see the evidence of my incompetence. Michael's lawyer presented the same documents Robert had already debunked. The neighbor's statement that she now said was false. The psychiatric evaluation that had actually concluded I was competent. Diane's testimony about my confusion, which Robert cross-examined and revealed was based on normal age-related forgetfulness, like misplacing keys. Then it was our turn. Robert called Dr. Patel first. He testified that I showed no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment, that I'd been fully competent during his evaluation, and that he'd recommended I be released. Robert then called Karen Mitchell, who testified about her assessment months earlier and confirmed I'd been managing independently, without any issues. Then Robert called the forensic accountant, who presented a detailed analysis of how Michael had misused his guardianship authority to transfer my assets to himself. Justice Morrison's expression grew colder with each piece of evidence. When the accountant finished, she asked Michael's lawyer if he had any explanation for why $700,000 from the sale of my house had gone into Michael's business account. The lawyer stammered something about care expenses and repayment for time spent managing my affairs. Justice Morrison cut him off. She said that guardianship was a sacred trust, that guardians were required to act in the best interest of the person under their care, and that what Michael had done appeared to be exploitation, not protection. She said she was terminating the guardianship effective immediately. She ordered Michael to return all of my assets within 7 days. She said she was referring the case to the police for investigation of financial exploitation of a vulnerable person, and she said she was ordering Michael to pay all of my legal fees. Michael's face went white. He tried to speak, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm to stop him. Justice Morrison then looked at me. She apologized for what I'd been through. She said the system had failed me, that I should never have been placed under guardianship without proper notice and evaluation. She said I was free to leave Meadowbrook immediately, and that she was issuing an order, preventing Michael from having any contact with me or my finances. I walked out of that courtroom a free man. Robert drove me straight to my house, except it wasn't my house anymore. Michael had sold it. The new owners had already moved in. I stood on the sidewalk looking at the house I'd built, the home where I'd raised my son, where Patricia and I had spent 51 years together. And it belonged to strangers now. Robert put his hand on my shoulder. He said we'd fix this, that we'd get the sale reversed, that we'd make this right. And over the next 2 months, that's exactly what we did. Robert filed a lawsuit to void the sale of the house on the grounds that Michael hadn't had valid authority to sell it. The new buyers were understandably upset, but their lawyer reviewed the case and advised them they didn't have clear title. They agreed to reverse the sale. Michael was ordered to return the $820,000. He tried to claim he didn't have it, that he'd invested it in his business and couldn't access it immediately. The judge didn't care. She gave him 30 days to return every penny or face contempt charges and possible jail time. Michael liquidated assets, borrowed money, and somehow came up with the full amount. I got my house back in September, 5 months after Michael had stolen it from me. The new buyers were compensated from Michael's pocket for their trouble, and I moved back into my home. But the damage was done. The house felt different now, violated. I hired a lawyer to file a police report for financial exploitation and fraud. The police investigated and charged Michael with fraud over $5,000, exploitation of a vulnerable person, and breach of fiduciary duty.